Welcome to the Tale of the Tape Boxing Podcast. Coming to you from the fight capital of the world, Las Vegas. Bringing you exclusive interviews with the biggest names in the boxing industry, both in and out of the ring. The Tale of the Tape Boxing Podcast is brought to you by Alvini & Associates Financial Services. Now, here's your host, Amal Shah.
Welcome to the Tale of the Tape Boxing Podcast, coming to you from Las Vegas. I'm your host, Amal Shah, and joining us today is Mike Coppinger of The Athletic. You can also catch him on the Pug and Cop Boxing Show, wherever you download podcasts, at Apple, Spotify. He's on Twitter at Mike Coppinger. He was named to the Big Leads 40 under 40. He was also previously worked with ESPN Plus, Fox Sports, along with USA Today and The Ring. Mike, you've been with all the alphabet soup of boxing. Tell us a little bit about how you got into boxing and covering the sport.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. Boxing's been my favorite sport since I was 16. Always wanted to work in boxing in some fashion. And in college, I went to George Mason University in Virginia, right outside D.C. I interned at USA Today and the Baltimore Sun. And during that internship at USA Today, I was able to cover as an intern the Paul Williams Sergio Martinez fight, the first fight, which was awesome in Atlantic City. And after that, I graduated college a year later in 2010. Started freelancing boxing a lot for USA Today, starting with the Jean Pascal Chad Dawson fight in Montreal that summer. I happened to be in Montreal finishing my degree, but studying French, and coincided with the fight. So I got lucky there, and then freelanced a bunch of fights, went to work for the NFL, circled and freelanced all along, circled back to USA Today, took a job there covering boxing in 2015, and just went from there.
That's fantastic. I don't think there's anything better than getting paid to sit ringside and watch a match while the rest of us usually pay to get into the arena. So I'm sure you've got some tremendous stories. But, you know, it's really amazing about your career is what you alluded to. You were able to start out at such a young age and get involved with so many great fights and then kind of make your name from there. You've been tremendous in the boxing realm. I know on social media, again, like I said, you can follow him on Twitter at Mike Coppinger, a great follow, has a ton of information. And you were able to break a story which kind of lets us get into maybe getting back to normalcy here a little bit with everything going on. There's a potential now. We're looking at the return of boxing here in Las Vegas on June 9th between Shakur Stevenson versus Rafael Rivera in a featherweight matchup. Is this something that you think is going to take place, or still some speculation? How far are we along in the process for both of these guys?
It's in the process of being finalized now. I expect it to get finalized. You know, there's no agreement yet, but it's pretty close. And it's not actually going to be a featherweight. It's going to be a little bit above featherweight. It's going to be a non-title fight. But it's a step in the right direction, although it's not the big fight that we all are hoping for. You know, we see the UFC with a way different structure there where they pay fighters far less, bringing some big fights during quarantine. In boxing, Bob Arum has said over and over, including on my podcast, that we're not going to see the big fights for a while you can't have a gate. And that's what we're going to get in Shakur Stevenson versus Rafael Rivera. But I don't know if that's the best reasoning, you know, not having the gate. We saw a fight with Shakur Stevenson and Joey Gonzalez, I think it was in October of last year, that barely pulled in any fans at all, and I believe it lost money at the gate. So I know times are hard right now, and companies are losing money for a variety of reasons, but I hope boxing can maybe take a short-term loss for long-term gain and make some bigger fights.
I love the point you just made. I think sometimes you've got to forego the short term in terms of the gate receipts in order to really grow the sport. I feel like this is a tremendous opportunity for boxing to get back into mainstream of American sports. Unfortunately, due to this pandemic, but really take advantage of it like the UFC has done and maybe schedule some pretty good fights. And yeah, I get you can't have an Errol Spence and Terence Crawford fighting without having the box office because you need that revenue. I can appreciate that completely. But at the same time, boxing has kind of gone off the mainstream a little bit. I feel like this is a chance, hey, let's get back into the good graces of the American public. I feel like these one-on-one sports, whether it's UFC, boxing, tennis, golf, where you have the opportunity for individuals to compete against each other, really should be able to have an opportunity to make some headway against the team sports.
Absolutely. I mean, everyone I know has liked boxing or watched a fight at one point or another. And boxing has lost so many fans. This is an opportunity to get some people back and remind people why they liked boxing in the first place, while people are stuck indoors with no other live sports to compete with. We saw UFC 249 as an event that had no major names, pulling over 700,000 pay-per-view buys in the U.S. alone. That's a staggering number when you consider Wilder Fury 2, an event that had way more marketing behind it, a far bigger event in scope that did almost 17 million at the gate, only pulled in between 800 and 850,000 buys. Wonder what Wilder Fury 2 would do now, and hopefully we're going to find out what boxing can do for the big event during this time. But if boxing keeps waiting, they run into an even bigger problem. What if MLB returns and the NHL returns and the NBA returns, and then you have the NFL, and now you're at the opposite end of the spectrum where every single sport is going at once, which never happens, and then boxing has to compete with that. I've already heard rumors that maybe these TV networks are going to tell boxing they have to wait a little bit because they don't have space for them at that point.
I love the point you just raised here. Mike Coppinger of The Athletic joining me here on Tail of the Tape Boxing. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Tail Tape Boxing. You can follow Mike on Twitter at Mike Coppinger. We are sponsored by Alvini & Associates. You can find them online at alviniassociates.com. Check them out for all your financial needs. Mike, I love some of the points you just raised. And to me, when I look at it right now, big picture-wise, I feel like this is, as we just talked about, an opportunity here for boxing to kind of get a foothold that they've been missing out on. If you were to be somewhat of a pseudo-commissioner overseeing everything in the sport and you were that one person, what improvements would you make to grow the sport and to make it better? Because I think there's a couple of things that make boxing a very unique sport and really can draw fans in. First of all, you don't require that time commitment that baseball requires or that basketball requires. You know, the great thing about a fight is somebody that you may like to watch, they're going to fight once every 4 months at best. So you're looking at a scenario where they're fighting 3 times a year, but realistically, the big fighters are going to fight once, maybe twice a year. I feel like boxing's got an opportunity with some really good fighters out there to kind of draw these fans in and make the sport what it should be, which is one of the premier events out there. We know a fight is going to last less than 1 hour. It's the ideal viewing event for television.
One of the first things I would do is I would get rid of these large cards. You have 5 and 6 fights or 7 fights when you're there in person, especially now with streaming. I mean, I don't think people care about all these fights. You know, maybe the hardcore fans do, and that's great and all, but just shrink it. Like you said, get the time commitment down. Just give me 2 fights. Give me 2 good fights rather than 7 okay fights. And now that you don't need ticket sellers on the card, that's more possible than ever before. You can experiment with that. Because oftentimes those local attractions that are selling tickets are buried on the card in that opening bout of an 8 or 9 fight undercard. That's one of the things I would do. Another thing is obviously you have to get rid of the sanctioning bodies. It's absolutely absurd that you have these guys telling, you, the promoter, how to run your business, what fights to make. These organizations are beholden to no one. They make up their rankings based on relationships and just, at the whim of whoever they like and don't like. There's no clarity to the sport, and it's just too confusing to fans. No one knows who the champion is. I've heard the counter argument that if you only have one title, it's hard for people to make a living. But, boxing not supposed to be democratic in that way. It's supposed to be the championship. The champion is recognized as being the best, and they have the one belt to be recognized as such. It's not, let's make a system where everyone benefits.
I love the point you just raised. You look at the welterweight division. You've got Errol Spence, he's WBC IBF champion. You've got Manny Pacquiao, he's a WBA champion. Of course, you've got Terence Crawford in there as well, who is the WBO welterweight champion. I just feel like when you've got so many great fighters out there, I would like to see a little bit more transparency and kind of rank the fighters. So many times you get top fighters get accused of fighting some tomato cans along the way to kind of enhance their record or collect a paycheck. I can understand the economics of that, but I'd like to see fans kind of get their money's worth and really get the best fights that we all want to see. And we'll get into that Errol Spence and Terence Crawford potential matchup down the line. But to me, I would like to see a little bit more transparency from that perspective. And then the other thing is, I don't know what your feeling on this is. I personally would like to see scoring at the end of each round announced. Now, I understand the criticism that, hey, a fighter, as he gets into the later stages, if he's got a 4-point lead going into the 10th or 11th round, he might be a little bit more relaxed and not come out as aggressively. But in every other sport, the scoreboard is posted in the arena. The opponent sometimes is not who you're playing at the end of the game. You're playing the clock. And I feel like in boxing, I don't know if necessarily benefits the sport, but I think it would make it more intriguing down the stretch. If a fighter knows he's behind on points, he's going to take some risk trying to get a knockout.
In theory, it would work, open scoring, but I've seen enough fights that had it, and the fighter didn't press any harder. And we've seen, I think of Adrian Broner, for example. Broner is a guy who will lose every round. We don't need the open scoring to tell us, and he doesn't try any harder until maybe the 12th round. Saul Porter, he throws no punches the entire fight. Broner does against Porter, and then he drops him in round 12. So in that instance, we didn't need the open scoring, and really he wasn't trying any harder. I'm against the open scoring. I understand what you're saying, how it works in other sports, but boxing isn't like that in the same ways. I wouldn't have a problem with maybe it being tried out again, but I think that's far down my list of things I want to see fixed first. I think one of the big problems, going back to what you said before, is how inactive fighters are. Let's take a Danny Garcia, for example, right? I think Danny Garcia is actually very likable. He gets a lot of flack. I think a lot of it's unwarranted, maybe because of how outspoken and controversial his father is. But, he also gets hammered for his lack of opposition. Let's look at Danny Garcia last year, right? He fights Adrian Granados in April, a guy who's undersized and had no hope. Fine, I have no problem with that. The problem then becomes that he doesn't fight until January of this year. And then he fights another similar opponent, undersized and no hope, in Ivan Redcash. Now, if Danny had fought Ivan Redcash, say, over the summer, and then fought Errol Spence in the fall, I would have no problem with him then coming back and fighting in January against another similar B-level opponent. The problem then becomes when you're fighting these B-level opponents once a year.
To me, when you have a fighter of Garcia's caliber, and you're looking at it now in a situation where this guy, by the time he gets back in the ring next, is going to have theoretically 2 fights in about 2+ years. And I just feel like you need to have a little bit more activity. And again, look, I'm not trying to force anybody who's an independent contractor to put themselves in peril or at risk if they don't want to do that, if they feel like they're in a good position. But I tend to agree with you. I think getting guys into the ring and being a little bit more active would help the sport long term. I just feel like, you see some guys fight, next thing you know, it's another 9 months, they become out of sight, out of mind.
Totally. I think of Mike Tyson. Tyson was fighting once a month, knocking guys cold on ESPN and the sort. And now Tyson at 53, he hasn't fought since 2005. He does a video, a few seconds of hitting pads, and the thing goes viral. And instantly, he's way more popular than any active fighter. It just goes to show you, people do like boxing. They just don't care about today's fighters by and large because they don't know to care. They haven't been made to care. It's not the fighter's fault or any one person's fault, but they just don't have enough of the story. It's like any of us that even work in boxing. Are any of us going to go crazy for the 4-rounders or, the fights, this club level fights? No, we're not. And I think that it's a trickle-down effect. I think the fans, the casual sports fan, has no idea about these fighters, and thus they don't care.
I love the point you just made. Tyson puts out a little viral clip, and next thing you know, everybody else in the sport is forgotten. And, the biggest name has retired in terms of Floyd Mayweather. In terms of recently, it would be interesting to see who's going to be the next really fan favorite that emerges. We know how popular Canelo is, and want to get into him in just a minute. But right now, if you're looking on the horizon, we're probably not going to see too many spectacular fights in 2020. You alluded to what Bob Arum talked about, not being able to get those gate receipts. If you project out to 2021, what are some of the fights either you want to see or some of the ones that the fans are really looking forward to seeing that you think could materialize?
I think next year, maybe we will finally get Terence Crawford and Errol Spence Jr. I think we'll get Spence back in the ring sooner than later, and I think he's going to go straight into a tough fight. Maybe even Danny Garcia, as we mentioned before. But so I think maybe next year could finally be the time that we get that Crawford fight. I'm hopeful also that, and I think it's realistic that we get Fury and Joshua next year, assuming Fury does beat Wilder again, even though they had negotiations between Fury, not negotiations, but there were talks about Fury and Joshua as they reported. I don't expect it to take place next. But I think those 2 fights off the bat could happen.
Yeah, I love the fact that you mentioned that Fury-Joshua one. That one obviously would take place across the pond. For people that may not be as familiar in terms of the European boxing scene, right now in Britain, they've got some terrific heavyweight fighters. How big of a fight would that be? I would assume that would have to take place at Wembley.
Fury-Joshua would be massive. I mean, it would be the biggest UK fight in history. I don't think that's hyperbole. I know the Middle East is very interested in Saudi Arabia in particular. It could be another example of that Saudi money coming in, although I wonder, as Bob Arum has pointed out, where the money is right now, considering oil is around, I think it's around $15 a barrel right now, and at its peak, last year it was like $50 a barrel. So I wonder how those economics are affected. But I know Saudi's very interested. Joshua Fury, I think that's another one of those fights that can really bring in the casual fan. And it doesn't matter that there's no Americans. Tyson Fury is becoming a big star here.
You're absolutely right. I mean, I think that would be a tremendous draw. And the heavyweight division's always had a ton of intrigue. And I think this would generate similar interest, even not just across the pond, but here in the States as well. Want to go through some of the top fighters in the world. These are guys that are universally recognized as top pound-for-pound fighters. Tell me what you think is on the horizon for them next, or how you kind of see their future in regards to what's going on for them long-term. Let's start with most people's number one right now, Canelo Alvarez. Is he a guy that we could see potentially fighting coming up this fall? Because I think the one concern I have with Canelo is he is such a draw in Las Vegas. After Floyd Mayweather retired, Canelo kind of became the guy that was almost a weekend here in Las Vegas. When he fights, you know, the MGM Grand Garden or T-Mobile are going to be sold out. He's going to bring in a ton of fans, and it's just good for the economics of the city of Las Vegas here in the fight capital of the world.
Canelo Alvarez is my number one fighter in the world too, and he's such a breath of fresh air. He's a great ambassador for the sport. He's a great guy. I love that he's recognized as the number one fighter. Before the pandemic hit, he had a deal in place to fight Billy Joe Saunders in a super middleweight title fight on May 2nd in Las Vegas. That is up in the air right now as the zone is trying to push Canelo Triple G3. Canelo did agree to fight Triple G after the Saunders fight in September, but that's all up in the air now, of course. And they're trying to figure out, the zone is, if they can go forward with Canelo Triple G3 without a gate. And that's a really hard one. You know, Canelo Triple G3 would do a big time gate. Definitely 8 figures. Can you really afford to lose that, especially with the purses these guys are going to command? You know, I know that, you know, we all know Canelo makes $35 million a fight, but I was told that to get this Golovkin fight over the hump, they had to agree to pay him $10 million more, and that $10 million would be coming from the gate. So, yeah, 45 for Canelo. Triple G makes $15 million per fight in his 6-fight deal with the zone. That's $7.5 million, and then another $7.5 million in equity. He gets $15 million extra for the Canelo fight. So we're talking about $45 million plus another what? $30 million.
Yeah.
So 45 and $30 million. I mean, $75 million. How are you going to get $75 million without a gate? It's not going to happen. So right now, the zone is trying to figure out, and the zone, Golden Boy, everyone involved is trying to figure out if Canelo Triple G3, when and if it can happen. And I just don't see it happening before fans return. I do think we could get Canelo back, maybe put him in September, if we can get fans in some capacity into an arena and maybe have them space out. Maybe you can fight a Saunders. Triple G can fight Zarameta like he wants. But otherwise, I don't know. That's a great question. Is Canelo going to fight with no fans? I mean, what's the alternative, right? Does he not fight at all? I think Canelo, knowing him, would rather fight someone.
I agree with you. Mike Coppinger of The Athletic joining me here on Tail of the Tape Boxing Podcast. Mike, my concern is that if you're Canelo, he's such a big draw. You know, I look at, you mentioned Mike Tyson, which you referenced a few minutes ago, Floyd Mayweather. Canelo's one of those guys, a handful of boxers, that it doesn't matter who he fights. It is going to be a sellout. It is going to be an impact weekend. It's whether, obviously in all likelihood, he's going to fight in Las Vegas. But let's say for some reason it was elsewhere. I just think your point is spot on. He has got to have the ability to draw the box office. And until fans can fill the stands, I don't think we're going to see that take place. I'm going to skip down a little bit on the list. This is from Ring Magazine. You alluded to Triple G fighting Canelo. If for some reason the numbers don't work out, or if they can't get Triple G on the card and we can't have fans in attendance, where does Triple G go here? Because my concern with him is this is a terrific fighter, didn't particularly care for the way the scoring went in the 2 fights against Canelo, and he's a little bit older. Remember, a lot of his time was spent over in Eastern Europe before he came stateside, and people really had an opportunity to see him. May not have that personality that's a draw, but I think this guy is still a fantastic fighter.
It's going to be interesting to see what Golovkin looks like. I wonder how much that fight with Sergey Derevyanchenko took out of him in October. Grueling fight. I actually scored it for Derevyanchenko. Wasn't a robbery. Could have won either way. Golovkin, I was told, actually returned to camp this week, and he was recovering from a calf injury. He is determined to fight his mandatory, Kamil Zarameta from Poland, and then he wants to go into the Canelo fight after that. I do think we'll see Golovkin back in August or September.
How about Lomachenko? I mean, this guy has been terrific. He is considered one of the top pound-for-pound fighters in the world. What do you see in his future?
It's another difficult situation. He's in Ukraine and obviously can't get into the country right now with the travel restrictions put in forth by our administration. So he was scheduled to fight Teofimo Lopez on May 30th at Madison Square Garden. It wasn't finalized yet, but it was pretty close. That was going to happen. I think it's more likely we see Lomachenko in a tune-up fight. Maybe they can have him fight in Eastern Europe. I don't know. It's just, I think it's so tough right now to forecast someone that's out of the country. And luckily, Golovkin is in the country.
Want to ask you about?
He lives here, so.
I'm sorry. I was going to say I wanted to ask you about a fighter maybe some people are unfamiliar with because he is in the lower weight class potentially. Can he move up to featherweight? Naoya Inoue. He's a guy that I think a lot of people may not be as well versed with because some of the smaller weight classes people just don't pay as close attention to except the hardcore fans. This kid is a beast. I mean, he has really done some damage in his weight class.
Yeah, I mean, he's called the Monster for a reason. It's a great nickname. He's number 2 on my pound-for-pound list. I think he's fantastic, and he was scheduled to fight John Real Casimero, a fellow champion at 118 pounds of the Philippines, on April 25th in Vegas before the pandemic hit. He's another guy. He's out of the country, so Top Rank really isn't sure what's going to happen with him in the near future. I think we're going to have to wait for these travel restrictions to ease up to get some clarity on a lot of these guys.
You mentioned it and you referenced it earlier, Terence Crawford, Errol Spence. This is a fight, at least from my perspective, I can't wait to see. I would give Crawford a slight edge there here in Las Vegas. When you look at it from a betting perspective, I would probably assume that Crawford would be a slight favorite. You might see it differently. First of all, how do you see this matchup? Where do you potentially see this fight taking place? And also, I know it's hard to project with all the health concerns around the world. When would this potentially take place?
So for when it would take place, I don't see it happening this year, certainly,
sure,
but I could see it maybe in the fall of 2021. It makes sense in Las Vegas. Well, actually, it makes more sense in Dallas. I mean, Spence drew over 40,000 at Cowboy Stadium against Mikey Garcia. Put it at Cowboy Stadium. I'm sure Crawford won't want to do it there for obvious reasons, but if you make the pot sweet enough, sure he would. What was the other part of your question?
I was just saying, in terms of the matchup itself, if you look at both of these fighters, is there one side you give an edge to or over the other, or this one of those, it just depends who's the best on that day?
Before Errol Spence's car accident, I would have made him the favorite. So I want to see how he looks first before I feel like to really know. But Spence is a much bigger guy than Terence Crawford. Crawford started at 135 pounds. Spence is a guy who fought at 152 in the Olympics, and he could easily fight at middleweight and not be out of place. And I think he will be at middleweight one day. Crawford, it's tough. I mean, he looks the part. He looks spectacular in all his fights. He obviously has great speed. He's a great finisher, great balance. But his opposition, I mean, the best guy he's ever fought is Victor Postal. Most of his opponents are B-level fighters, guys like Yorkis Gamboa, who is undersized and past his prime. He hasn't been tested, and Spence has. Spence went over to England to fight Kell Brook. He had a very tough fight with Sean Porter, who I think is an underrated fighter. So I'm still going to give the edge to Spence, but I'm going to have to see how he looks.
I want to ask you about one more fighter in Ring Magazine's top pound-for-pound guys, Alexander Usyk. This kid is unbelievable. I don't know if a lot of people have seen him. Big guy out of the Ukraine. He's really an up-and-coming guy who I think I'm looking forward to see him take on some more big challengers.
Yeah, Usyk, I was excited to see him really test himself at heavyweight. He was set to fight Derek Chisora. Chisora is more of a gatekeeper, but really tough guy who can punch and durable. I think that was the perfect test for him to see where Usyk is at, considering Chaz Witherspoon, a journeyman who hadn't fought in years, wasn't bad last year. Usyk was terrific at cruiserweight, and I think they should go right back into that Chisora fight when they can.
I want to get to Twitter. We've got some very good questions, Mike, for you coming in from Twitter. This segment is brought to you by Alvini & Associates. You can find them online at alviniassociates.com, ALVINI, for all your financial needs. You can also do it the old-fashioned way and pick up the phone and call them at 302-836-8490 between 8:30 and 4:30 Eastern Time. That's Alvini & Associates. Will American fighters consider fighting in Asia first if they reopen to spectators sooner than here in the United States?
Sure they would, especially guys I really feel for who really rely on boxing for an income. The guys that are making, $40,000, $50,000 a fight. I'm sure they would jump at the opportunity to fight in Asia if that's the only choice. I mean, people need to make money and earn a living. And, not enough relief is really coming from the government. I don't see why not. I mean, see pro wrestlers do it all the time. Wrestling is huge in Japan.
What is next for Deontay Wilder? Where does he go from here, particularly with Fury and Joshua still looming? What's in the cards for him long term?
I suspect we'll see Wilder and Fury fight a third time next, although that's another tricky one because you can't really do it without a gate. And, if it drags on long enough, Top Rank and PBC say, all right, look, we don't want to do Wilder Fury 3 without the gate. Why don't we have Fury and Wilder to do tune-ups in the meantime? I could see that. But unless Wilder gets knocked over with some crazy step-aside fee like 10, 15 million, I think his pride is going to dictate he goes through with the rematch.
In terms of, you had talked about it a little bit, if you can expand on it somewhat in terms of just maybe some matchups that you're looking at that are a little bit under the radar. It doesn't have to be an Errol Spence, Terence Crawford type, but maybe a couple of guys that you have your eye on, some young fighters that maybe people are unaware of that you're looking forward to fighting against somebody that's a little bit more experienced or known. Anybody out there that you're kind of really looking forward to in 2021 potentially fighting?
I love Joshua Buatsi, the light heavyweight from England. Super fast, good power. I would love to see him tested. Maybe you test him with a veteran like a Jean Pascal next year. Ryan Garcia, I'm really enthralled by. 2 first-round knockouts in a row. He more than anyone else, in my opinion, has the chance to be the face of boxing going forward after Canelo. He has a massive social media following. I think he has like over 5 million followers on Instagram already. He's a great personality, good-looking kid. I know there was a lot of talk of him maybe fighting Gervonta Davis this year, but I think he'll be stepping up for sure in 2021, whether it's Gervonta Davis or Devin Haney. And also, light heavyweight, I like Artur Beterbiev a lot. Beterbiev versus Dmitry Bivol is a fascinating fight. And another big fight for Beterbiev would be against Eleider Alvarez, although from there is that they're both trained by Marco Ramsey, but it would be a big fight. They both live in Montreal.
That'd be pretty interesting. That would be one I think we'd get a tremendous amount of interest. Beterbiev, as you alluded to, I think he's a guy that people may not be as familiar with, but a lot of people have him highly rated and ranked. Should be very interesting to see what happens. It's Mike Coppinger of The Athletic. Mike, thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're very busy, but if you don't necessarily follow a lot of people on Twitter, one person you definitely want to follow is Mike Coppinger. His knowledge is second to none, as you can tell, and his passion for the sport is unbelievable. Mike, I love your backstory. It's kind of encouraging to people, hey, if they want to kind of break into something, whether it's in media, what have you, your story is amazing. You get in there, and right from the jump, you're very fortunate, and all of a sudden, you've ascended and had a tremendous career, and we continue look forward to reading your writing on The Athletic.
Thank you so much for having me.
Appreciate the time. Again, you can follow him on Twitter at Mike Coppinger. Also, follow Tail of the Tape Boxing Podcast on Twitter at Tail Tape Boxing. Thank you so much. I want to thank Alvini & Associates. You can catch them online at alviniassociates.com. This is Amal Shah for Tail of the Tape Boxing Podcast.